started so that we can get done on time. Let me welcome you to our final David S. Saurman Provocative Lecture of the semester. It's hard to believe this is our third one already, and it's almost the end of the semester. Although I can sort of feel the tension building up. I don't know about any of you. Possibly. Thank you for taking time to join us this evening. My name is Jack Estel. I'm a lecturer with the Department of Economics. This would be an excellent time for us all to reach in and pull out our alter ego and maybe put it in some, there we go, thank you. I'd also like to mention that we will have a meeting of the Barstool Economists at Flames Eatery after the lecture. Flames Eatery, for those of you who don't know, and it's probably not many of you at this point, is at 4th and San Fernando. We will meet over there immediately after the lecture for some further discussion. If you'd like to ask Dirk, he's been kind enough to agree to join us over there about markets and oil. We look forward to having you. Anyone is, or everyone is considered a potential member of the Barstool Economists. It's actually a virtual group of people who communicate on the Barstool Economists as a Yahoo group. So if you're interested in joining, you're welcome to contact me and I'll see about getting you on the list. But in the meantime, I understand that those people who are thinking about joining will be able to have some beer and pizza. And I think that's at the department's expense, at least for the first round. So I don't know, it might be worth coming over. We sponsor 3 provocative lectures every semester, and we are still working on our lectures for the fall semester. So as soon as I have those, I will post them up on the department website, and we hope that you will join us again for those. This lecture series started 16 years ago, and is named after David S. Saurman, who was a professor here for many years and also my mentor. And it is our hope that you will enjoy this lecture tonight, as we have those in the past. This is a way we foster the department's vision for higher education, the challenge of ideas, and the development of critical thinking in an environment of respectful intellectual discourse. I got it right that time. So we hope that you will relax and listen to Dirk Mateer as he discusses why we will never run out of oil. Dirk will provide a question and answer period at the end of the presentation to allow the audience to explore their own questions about this. It is our hope that this will encourage a greater understanding of the function of markets and of resource allocation. So I'd like to say a couple of words about Dirk. If you don't know Dirk Mateer, you have not heard of him or haven't looked him up, I think we first met 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago now, at a conference for what we call API, or the Association of Private Enterprise Education. And I first listened to Dirk speak about his passion, which was, I don't know that it was his original passion, but it was, how can you bring the principles of economics to large classes? So Dirk teaches classes from 500 to 700 students. And he does this not only in these large classes, but actually teaches a class of micro and macro in one semester doing that. So this is a fine art. This is something that's very, very difficult to do. And Dirk has received many awards for them, not the least of which, let me just look at these. Great Teachers in Economics Series from Florida State University, and the inaugural winner of the Economic Communicator Contest at the Association of Private Enterprise Education. He has taught at University of Pennsylvania and is currently at the University of Arizona. He has several research interests generally around education, teaching education, and he has recently published 2 books, Principles of Economics and Essentials of Economics. So please give Dirk a warm hand. Thank you.
So it's great to be here. Thanks for coming out. I know your time is valuable. I'm going to try to get right to it here and talk about the economics of oil and why I believe, this is the big finish here, why I believe we'll never run out of oil despite what you might think. So this particular lecture is laid out into 3 parts. But before I go too far, what I want to make sure is we're all on the same page. Because this topic is a topic which you might feel passionately about. I feel passionately about it. My question to you to think about right now is this. All right, so just read this quote right here. If you really think the environment is less important than the economy, try holding your breath while you count your money. I believe in the environment the same way you believe about the environment. There's a catch, however, though. The catch is this. I'm an environmental economist. And you might consider yourself an environmentalist. What's the difference? The difference isn't very big. We all believe in the same thing. We all want what? We want clean air. We want clean water. We want uncongested roads. We want a space that we can all enjoy collectively as a group. The difference is that the environmental economist wants all those same things that you want, but I count the cost as well as the benefits. Because a good economist always thinks about what are the benefits of engaging in a particular policy and what are the costs. So for me, they're trade-offs. And the trade-offs are pretty simple. I want a great environment. If we can afford to have a perfectly pristine environment, that would be amazing. But I also want what? I want fantastic education, right? And world-class health care. And I want a great infrastructure. And I want a super fast internet, right? And I want lots of other things that you also want, right? So when I say that I want a great environment, that's fantastic. I do, right? But I also want to make sure we get all the other things. And that means we're going to have to think about how to allocate our resources. That's the thrust of this talk. So here's the roadmap. We're going to talk about American economic history to make sure you're good to go with that. We're going to look at falling prices because depending upon where you sit, right, falling prices might be viewed as a good thing from a consumer standpoint, but as a producer of oil, not so great. That'll be the second part of the talk, and then I'll do a policy analysis, and I'll break this down and give you some predictions. All right, so that's where we're going to head throughout this particular lecture. So here's where I want to start. I want to go way back. So when people really didn't have much of a clue about oil, right? All they knew was that you could get some oil, right, if you happened to hunt whales. So what did we do in the 1850s? We hunted whales, right? And we hunted them to near extinction. That's the tragedy of the commons, but we were able to get what? Some oil, which was very valuable in the early days, lighting lights, kerosene, different things like that. So that was extremely valuable. The price of oil kept going up because it get harder and harder to find giant whales like Moby Dick there, all right? So the idea is, right, that the whales were further out. You had to go further. That meant the cost of bringing the oil back was higher. Now, that's a technological problem, right, because eventually there wouldn't be any oil. In fact, back in the 1850s, people didn't even know what oil was, right? It was just black stuff that was on the surface of the ground, and it was sticky and it was messy. Had no idea what to do with it. So the early days here are important to think about. Here's a picture of Titusville, Pennsylvania, 1860s. Now that's a black and white picture, so it wasn't actually that dirty. I just want to be clear about that. But you know, they were doing what? They were putting oil derricks, sometimes as many as 10 per acre, right, just to get the oil out of the ground. Now that oil was very close to the ground, easy to get out. And that was the first mini oil boom from Pennsylvania. And that took off, and as soon as it took off, right, oil prices did what supply and demand would tell us to do, right? If you increase the supply of oil, the price of oil went up or down. You guys got it. It went down, all right? So it starts to go down in Pennsylvania because oil is easier to get a hold of. We found a way through technology to get at this. But one thing to remember is this is the 19th century. And oil is brand new. And the dominant way of supplying energy is coal, right? So that's why I've got this little rock here plugged in. That's where we got our electricity. So we built a lot of our infrastructure in the eastern United States based upon coal. And as oil came online, well, we transitioned a little bit more towards oil. But coal remained the dominant source of energy throughout the 19th century. I don't want you thinking, despite those oil derricks, that oil was everywhere and it was plentiful. There weren't distribution networks. It wasn't easy to refine it. It was just difficult to make oil work as well as coal. And so the entire economy was built on oil. on coal. I got a question for you. I'm going to give you some clues. This is an interactive part of the lecture. And so I'd like you to guess what country this is. All right, so here are a bunch of clues. If you got a cell phone, right, or you've got, just go ahead and text to this number the word "my guess," and then leave a space, and then put in your country. All right, so as soon as you get enough clues here, tell me what this is. Life expectancy 47. Just as a frame of reference, the United States today, life expectancy is 79. Almost nobody owns an automobile. Income per person is roughly $5,000. Again, frame of reference, United States today, about $53,000 per person. In an area here like the Silicon Valley, I believe your number is about 80,000. Most people live less than a mile away from their jobs, so they don't commute very far. Only about 1/3 of homes have running water. And about 140 out of every 1,000 children die before their first birthday. Think on it for a moment. See if you can come up with that country. I'm going to activate. These are stats. That is correct. So let's see what you guys are coming up with here. I got India. I got Saudi Arabia. I'm looking for a few more here, guys. But that's okay. It's a good start. There's Syria. Zimbabwe. None of those answers are right, though, so far, just to let you know. So you want to go further afield than that. See if you can't come up with the right answer here. Okay. Good stuff. I see it. It got broken up, though. All right, so it's right there. We had United. Well, it keeps moving around. And States. That's us. That's us exactly 100 years ago. And the reason I go back 100 years and make you think about the United States is if you lived in the United States in the early 20th century, your life was difficult. You, right, are what we think of as an emerging third world country, where on $5,000 for the year, you got just more than $10 a day to live on. And by any reasonable measure, right, people weren't living very long, and they were living difficult, hard lives, and they were working a long time. In that environment, when people think about energy needs, energy is a luxury, is not they don't have enough money to think of energy as being something that's a luxury good. The way we think of energy today is we think, oh, right, we've got so much money, right, that we can spend time and effort trying to improve the environment. Back then, right, they were just trying to get by. So you might be tempted to say, to impose your 21st century belief set on the individuals 100 years ago, they're not thinking the way we're thinking. They're just thinking, here's an opportunity to better my life, and I'm delighted that we have what? Some oil we can get out of the ground and do some stuff with, right? That's where they're at. So I don't want you going and saying, okay, fine, you know, maybe we shouldn't have done all this stuff, right? We needed to go through the process of creating an infrastructure to get the oil out of the ground, to get richer, to be able to make the choices that we make today that are more environmentally sensitive. All right, so that's one thing to think about right there. I'm going to pull that off the screen, and we're going to head back into the PowerPoint. Okay. So from here, I'd like to introduce you to a guy who has a very bad reputation. Anybody know his name? Yes. That's John D. Rockefeller, right? And in 1910 or so, he became the first billionaire on this planet. If you do all the math, right, to convert $1 billion in 1910 to today, J.D. Rockefeller was worth about, in today's dollars, $300 billion. Think Warren Buffett, think Bill Gates, times about 5. All right, so he was that important. He was extremely influential because he did what? Because he was able to systematically find a way to consolidate the oil industry and use economies of scale to get more oil to more people at a lower price point. That's what J.D. Rockefeller did. He wasn't essentially worried about the environment. That's not his time frame, right? What he was worried about is getting a lot of oil out of the ground very quickly. He did a really good job of that. So here's what happened because he was so good at getting the oil out of the ground. They broke up his company in 1911, right? And when they broke up his company, you can see Standard Oil Company here at the top. They broke it into all these different parts right here, which eventually through time became a lot of the companies that you would recognize, but really they're four major players that are a derivative of Standard Oil Company: Exxon, Chevron, BP, and Marathon. And so we have a lot more oil companies out there, but they were essentially because Standard Oil got too much power in the marketplace and was able to use that like a monopolist would use that power. So again, you see his companies broken up. Now you might be tempted to think, well, how is it? Why did they break him up? Did they break him up because he was predatory pricing, or there was something else going on called lower marginal cost? J.D. Rockefeller did not predatory price. Definition of predatory pricing is that you do what? You lower your prices below your costs. He didn't have to do that. He had the most efficient distribution network for getting oil out of the ground and moving it to the people that wanted it. So what he did was he always marked up his product, not predatory pricing. He won because he had lower marginal cost. That's one way to become a monopolist, right? You simply have lower costs than everybody else. And on the surface of that, that's not a bad thing. But of course, when you use your monopoly power, right, then of course the Justice Department gets involved. All right, so they broke him up to create more competition, but not because he had relentlessly driven his rivals out of the marketplace because he wanted to undercut them. He just had lower costs than everybody else. So it's not predatory pricing. Let me show you what's going on here. This is some data going back to 1860s. And the main thing you want to pay attention to here, because we're all good economists, is the real price versus the nominal price. The nominal price is the price at the time that the oil was sold. The nominal price makes oil look ridiculously cheap, right? If you go back here to the late 19th century, you can see they were selling oil for just a few dollars. That's not interesting. You want to convert those numbers to real numbers. You can see the price of oil was really high when it first came out. So if you're looking at the 19th century, specifically the 1860s, we were doing what? We were transitioning from getting our oil from whaling to getting our oil out of the ground. It was really expensive, but you can see that that chart right there goes down pretty quickly. And you can see it right here, as you can see that the value is just dropping off here in time. So how does that happen? That happens because of John D. Rockefeller. All right? John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil made that happen. All right? So they lowered the price of oil by, again, using economies of scale, the basic way that we think about a business that grows in size, and as it grows in size, it's able to sell more at a lower cost. Now, the comparison that's interesting is not to leave you in 1910. What I want to do is fast forward to today. When you fast forward to today, what you see are all of those spin-offs from Standard Oil. And they're competing as oil companies, and they're competing against state-run companies. They're competing against OPEC. And we have a very vibrant, although very large set of companies here, big companies competing. We don't have a monopoly anymore. We have something that you might consider to be more like an oligopoly in the sense that there's some reason to believe that these businesses might be able to join forces. That's the idea behind OPEC. So the comparison to today, to the past, is radically different. There's just a lot more competition in the oil marketplace, and there's been a lot more innovation along the way at the same time. So here's your oil production in the 20th century. So now I've picked it up in 1930, and there's a couple things here worth noting. You can see that worldwide crude production is very low going back to the Great Depression. Right? So we weren't getting that much oil out of the ground. Over time, we got better at getting the oil out of the ground. We found more deposits, more reserves, we drilled more wells, right? We simply got to the marketplace. So when you get all the way here to the 1970s, what you see is a peak. And the prevailing philosophy at the time was that oil production had peaked. And that would mean that worldwide oil production, because we only had a certain amount of known oil reserves, that we would find ourselves having reached the peak and oil production would slowly fall off. And it starts to do that for a little bit, although you can see that additional production comes online, right? And it comes online because people were finding oil in places they hadn't looked before, like the Arctic, and companies were also discovering ways to extract oil from oil fields that previously they thought had been tapped out. So we never quite really reached peak oil. Because if we had reached peak oil with the number of people being born on this planet and the demand for oil, the price of oil today would be really, really high. But so on the supply side, we've always been able to keep on pushing the supply up. That's part of a story that you want to think about from the historical trend. Here's how the U.S. production fared during the same period. And so, again, going back to 1930, U.S. production was also on the rise, just the way it was globally. Now, globally, you saw those numbers ended up being where? Around 70 million barrels a day. U.S. production topped right here, 10,000, or in this case, what you could think of as 10 million barrels a day, right around the early 1970s. And at that point, the U.S. was responsible for about 1 in 6 barrels of oil that were produced globally. We're responsible for less of that today. U.S. production has fallen off. You can see that right here. But there's a second part to this story that's really fun. The second part of the story begins right here. There it is. That decline was broken by the ability to frack oil. So when we could go back and look at existing oil fields and use fracking technology to bust out part of the oil that previously we couldn't get to, all of a sudden we could get to a lot more oil. So there's been sort of a second supply enhancement here just within the last 5 years. And that's really big news both for the consumer and the producer when you think about the oil market. Here's the other thing you need to know. We're not alone in producing oil. So who else is out there produces a lot of it? You got Saudi Arabia right here. So that would be the purple dashed line. They produce a little bit more than 9 million barrels of oil a day. Russia produces a similar amount. And the United States is right there with them. So the three major oil producers globally are Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the United States. That might make you think that, well, we must be energy independent because we're a really big producer of oil. Who thinks that's the case? None of you bought in there. All right, congratulations. All right, we are also a really big demander of oil. So it turns out in this country that we produce a lot of oil, right? But we want even more. All right, so we have a nearly insatiable demand for oil. So I'll get to that in just a bit, but here's how the supply and demand interact in terms of prices. So you can see this right here. So you've got the prices going all the way back here to the 1860s. The price of a barrel of oil, about $120 in today's dollars. Going way down, all right? So this is driven down by Rockefeller right in here. We get to what? Lower prices, right? It stays low, and the market seems to be pretty well behaved until we show up where? The 1970s. Now, there's two things happen in the 1970s that are really interesting. The first thing that happens in the 1970s is OPEC gets together, all right? So you've got the OPEC, oil-producing countries, and they decide, hey, we produce a lot of oil between Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq and all of their other fellow countries. What are we going to do? We're just going to use our market power, and we're just going to double the price of oil. Boom! Right there, 1973, 1974. That's that first spike. And they thought, well, that's great. We just made double the money. So let's try it again in 1979. Boom! There you go. Now, that came as a huge surprise to countries like the United States, which were energy dependent. Even though we produced a lot of oil, we needed a lot more, and that meant that we went through a lot of hardship in the 1970s adjusting to these two separate price shocks. That's what you want to think about right here, is the economy was caught off guard on two different occasions. So what did that mean? If you weren't around in the 70s, It meant the following. It meant that there were gas shortages. The speed limit got dropped from 70 to 55. So as you drive around today, just imagine yourself at 55. It's not a pleasant experience. You know it, right? If you've been on the road and you're used to 70 and you have to go back to 55, it's like you're practically standing still, all right? And that's how people felt in the 1970s, is that all of a sudden the speed limit was lower. And because there were gas shortages, because we couldn't get enough oil from Saudi Arabia, there were these huge lines at the gas stations. And based upon your license plate, you could go in on one particular day but not the other. So you always had to kind of like figure this out. So that seems like it's a long time ago, but it's not. I mean, that's not a pretty recent economic history. We have these problems created by these two very unexpected events in the 1970s. And so the OPEC price spikes basically were the cause for a lot of problems during the 1970s. So there's a little macro history here coming at you. So in the 1970s, or even before that, economists believed that there was a trade-off between inflation and unemployment called the Phillips curve. And that Phillips curve was something you could reliably sort of look at, and you could figure out, right, well, we'll take a little more inflation, but that'll mean we'll have less unemployment, all right? But all of a sudden we got to the 70s, and it was like, we got both. We got inflation, we got unemployment, right? How did this happen? This wasn't supposed to be this way. And we just basically overreacted in this country. And what we did was we engaged in really bad macro policy. We actually pumped a lot of money into the economy trying to get the unemployment rate down based on the Phillips curve, not knowing that the actual impulse for the inflation was on the supply side, not the demand side. And so we ended up creating this, right? Gross national product falls and inflation rises to a really high number. That's not a good thing for the economy to be stuck with high unemployment and high inflation. And it's that period of the 70s, which are marked by these two OPEC price spikes, that's a really difficult time for policymakers from a macro standpoint. All right? So this can have big macro repercussions when things go wrong. And we also had bad micro policy to top it off. So we had price controls, which meant you had basically the price of gasoline and natural gas were not allowed to rise beyond a certain level. That led to shortages, and there were all these hidden costs. The number one hidden cost was the way in which we make money in the United States is we're really efficient and good at providing services without wasting a lot of time. Just imagine you had to go to the pumps to get your oil, right, and you had to wait in a super long line. There's something called opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is what? You could be doing something else with your time rather than waiting for gasoline. But when you don't allow markets to regulate the prices, what you get is non-market activities regulate prices. In this case, people have to wait in line. There's still a price, but the price is now how much time are you going to spend looking for the gasoline. That's a very different world that we live in right there. So bad macro, bad micro, 1970s, right? And you get the idea, right? We were caught completely off guard. So that's the first part. I wanted to give you enough background that once we start to talk about how oil affects the economy, you have some sense of how it's affected the economy in the past. In this second part right here, what we're going to do, right, is just think about where you sit, all right? So each of you is sitting here in this room, and I suspect you're kind of more like me than an oil producer, all right? So you're probably sitting there going, well, I care about gasoline because it costs me more money if it's more expensive, right? That's where you sit. But if I'm an oil company, right, then I'm thinking I love high prices, not low prices, all right? So this whole section is about the consumer-producer dynamic. And I've got some quotes for you to think about. Here's the first one. They make me angry because I have to look at an invoice after invoice, and that still has a fuel surcharge tacked on. So during the most recent uptick in oil prices, airlines and other companies added on fuel surcharges rather than raising their base price. And the idea was that you and I would accept that because you understood that that higher expense was something that they're being forced to pass on to you and me. But we might react differently if they had just raised the price. We might have been like, well, why did they raise their price? Oh, I just raised it because there's a surcharge here. Well, so you would think in 2016 that all these surcharges would be removed, It hasn't happened. All right? They're just still on the books. Why take off a surcharge, right, when people will still pay it? It's just sort of folded into the way we think now. And so that's one way in which life is different. Here's another one. The decrease in price has resulted in me putting more money in savings and having more for vacations and extra items I've been avoiding for a long time. That's like you and me winning, right? When we think about this process. It's like, hey, low gasoline prices, more money left over for me. My income's the same, but my purchasing power is bigger, right? That's one way to think about this. Here's another one. Man, this is a nice comment. I wish it were a bigger deal. Instead of paying $50 a week for gas, I pay $30. Saving $20 a week is nowhere near enough to change my lifestyle. Is my case so different than the average person? So here's a person who recognizes that they're getting a good deal at the pump, but they're actually going to the next level, and they're sort of doing the analysis and going, yeah, I like that $20, but where am I going to put that $20? Is it really making my life that much better? And then the fourth one here, if we allow low energy prices to derail the climate change negotiations, low oil prices are bad. Right? And that's a totally different way of thinking about this, but a totally accurate way of thinking about it, right? If you're worried about climate change. So all these things are in play, and they affect our lives when you think about how the price of something like oil changes in the economy. So here's the U.S. economy, and what I'd like to get at here is there's two things happening on this graphic. The one that's the most interesting is the blue, but I'll start with the red. Okay, so here we go. This is U.S. crude oil production. This is just that part of that previous graphic that you would have seen where after the 1970s, U.S. oil production started to fall because we had tapped what? All of our known reserves, right? And so our oil wells weren't doing all that well, right? And you can see that we just weren't producing a lot of oil. And then boom, right? We get what? We get the shale revolution, all right? So with the shale revolution, finally we were able to do what? We'll go back in and get out that oil we couldn't get the first time. So all of a sudden you see this big increase, which is the red line. And what that means is that our dependency on foreign oil, which had been rising, because these things are going to move in opposite direction, right? If U.S. oil production is falling and we still need oil as an energy source, then net oil imports would have to be rising, right? And so net oil imports had reached a really high level by the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s, and that has fallen a whole lot. But it's still 34%. We're still an oil importer in this country. All right? So we produce a lot, but we need a lot more. And that's part of the reason why, since we're an importer of oil, that when the price of oil falls, right, and on net, we're an importer, that just happens to make it better for our consumers. Okay? So that's why you could think of this as being a good thing from the consumer side. So how much benefit is there to the U.S. economy? Here's one way of thinking about this. Right? Since we're an importer, we get economy-wide savings. They're spread out what? Across a lot of consumers, all who are saving a little bit of money, and the costs are going to be borne by producers who are receiving lower payments. And so here's the effect that was estimated by the Council of Economic Advisors. And so what you need to know is compared to 2014, before we had this most recent downturn in oil prices, the price of a barrel of oil was a little bit over $100. Which is high by historical standards. Now today it's about $45 a barrel. So when the Council of Economic Advisors looked at that, they said if oil remains below $50 a barrel, compared to 2014, we're going to get what? We're going to get about a 0.4% boost to GDP. Now, I don't know about you. 0.4% boost to GDP? What the heck is that? I barely know what GDP is, right? And so that's gross domestic product. That's how much stuff we produce in this economy. 0.4% sounds kind of small, Dirk. It is kind of small, right? But when you have a $20 trillion economy, 0.4% is $80 billion. That's some real money right there. So we get that $80 billion every year that the price stays what? Stays below $50 compared to what? Compared to $100 barrel of oil. Right? So that's just a little boost for all of us in terms of our economic activity, which is a really cool thing to think about. All right? So that's one way of measuring this. How much does it actually measure, though? I gave you those quotes from people, but quotes from people aren't the same thing as actually doing the math. So let's actually just work through the math ourselves to figure all of this out. All right? So let's do the back of the napkin approach right here. Here it is. The average household buys 600 gallons of oil a year. With gas prices down about $1 from a year ago, give or take, right, that's $600 in savings per household works out to about $12 a week. So when you're really looking at this, right, what you see is that there's $600 to be had, spread out across the year. And the question is whether or not it's all frittered away, one Starbucks or In-N-Out burger at a time, right? And so at the end of the week, you can't really tell the difference, right? Or is somehow that $600, right, going to get put to some use somewhere? Are people going to do what? I'm going to go out and buy a new dishwasher, right? I'm going to do something else that's bigger with that money because I think more about the long-run implications of that. I think you get a little bit of both. I think it's reasonable to expect what? That a lot of people just see the extra money in their checking account and they spend it right away on something. And there's some people who are like more intentional about how they spend their funds. And they might redirect those funds towards ways that can make their lives better by buying bigger ticket items. So the consumer does benefit in this scenario. There's also a global impact here. Almost every country on this planet are net oil importers. There's just a few that are exporters. And so that means globally, lower oil prices is better for the planet in the sense that consumers all across this world are going to be better off. The countries that are hardest hit here because of the dependence on oil reserves for political stability ends up being Venezuela, Russia, and Iran. And we'll talk about two of those countries in the last section. So what you need to think about here is that different countries feel this in different ways. And those countries have oil-dependent economies. So this is a little part I'm going to call domestic winners and losers. And it depends where you live. So any of these areas that are outlined up here are the oil-producing areas where we've been able to use fracking to a large extent to tap into oil reserves that had previously been tapped out. And so in this part of the world, I mean, you can look at Texas, right? You can look at Hawaii, Wyoming, and Colorado where they have some areas there. In southern New York, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. And then you've got North Dakota. In those areas where the price of oil has plummeted by about 60%, for them, it's a localized economic catastrophe because their economies are built upon oil production. And that means that you lose jobs, right? And people move out of those areas and they have to relocate until what? Until oil prices become higher again. But sitting here in San Jose, that's a win. Right? There we are. All right? There's no oil production nearby here. So it's all what? It's just all good for households in the San Jose area. That's one way of thinking about this. Here's another way of thinking about, maybe you need to personalize it. So in the early 2010s, every time the unemployment rate came out by state, it's always one state that had the lowest unemployment rate, and it would be North Dakota. And that unemployment rate was around 2%. You could not get enough people to go to North Dakota to do the jobs that needed to be done. That's how you get a sign like, "Welcome to Williston, North Dakota, Boomtown, USA," right? Because in the oil fields up there, there were high-paying jobs, there wasn't enough housing, right? It was just basically the number of workers they needed was way above the number of workers that they had there. And that existed all the way into 2014 because oil prices stayed really high. Right? And people were constantly moving to those areas. And with story after story, if you want a job, a high-paying job, find your way to North Dakota. Well, Boomtown is no longer Boomtown. It's just been boomed. All right? Basically what happens is, right, that particular area, people now are leaving at a pace of about 1,000 individuals a month are leaving that area. It's not a highly populated area to begin with. So the boom is over. It's the boom and bust of the energy cycle. And so in this particular case, you got very real impacts in part of this country. And other parts, like California, you don't see those impacts. But they matter. They matter on that localized scale. So I want you to make sure that you think about that. The other thing I want you to think about is this. If you have an extra $12 in your pocket, and you know that extra $12 comes from where? Comes from gasoline being cheaper. How might you spend that? Yeah, you might just pull in to the In-N-Out, right, or the Starbucks and spend it right away. Or you might do what? you might recognize that you're not going to have to pay as much for gasoline. And as soon as you recognize that, you might think about the long term, and you might think to yourself, well, I've sacrificed and gotten a slightly smaller car, which is more fuel efficient, right? And so at that point, if you were thinking long term, what might you do? You're going to buy yourself a bigger vehicle. Now, that's all predicated upon what? You have to believe that lower gasoline prices are here to stay for the next, let's call it 7 to 10 years, because that's how long you're going to have a vehicle. But if you really believe prices are low enough, then you would alter your consumption patterns. So, and there has been some evidence, at least in car dealerships, that consumers' preferences have shifted rather quickly in a world of low oil prices towards bigger vehicles. All other things equal, people prefer more luxury. So that's one way of thinking about this. I'm a little bit skeptical that that's going to happen in mass until we get where? Till we get to sort of believing that the price of gasoline here in California will stay under $3, or where I am will stay near $2. All right? So the idea is at some point we just get used to it, and it's no longer a surprise that the price of gasoline is where it is. We don't remember 2014, we just remember 2016. And then once we're used to it, we go ahead and we could spend with some sense of permanence. That's the other way. Here's another thing you might want to think about. So out here in the West, we have all kinds of clean energy. We get clean energy from wind, solar, water, and it turns out that the decision to get an electric vehicle versus a gas-powered vehicle, it's radically different in different parts of the country. So in this little study that was done last year, they actually calculated based upon where the energy comes from on the electric grid, whether or not it would make more sense for you to get an electric vehicle versus a gasoline-powered vehicle. And it's very different because, again, clean energy over here. But if you were to go back to the upper Midwest, where a lot of the electricity is generated from power plants which use gasoline, coal as their primary source, if you're plugging in your electric vehicle, let's just for the sake of argument say they're in northern Pennsylvania, and that electric grid comes from coal, right? It turns out that your electric vehicle is worse for the environment than just simply getting a gas-generated vehicle. So there's disproportionate ways of thinking about the energy grid as well that matters. And because what? Because we're going to reduce the price of gasoline, right, in this equation in our minds, we're going to be altering the types of choices that people make with respect to choosing electric vehicles versus choosing gas-powered vehicles. That's also going to get altered, the big picture here, as you think about it. Here's another thing for you to think about. In the United States, we don't have a whole lot of gasoline taxes. All right, so if the average price per gallon excluding taxes is $2.65, then the average add-on here in the United States is just another 42 cents. That's different, obviously, in California, where California has additional gasoline taxes tacked onto that. But just by comparison, you can see what a lot of other developed countries do throughout Europe, where they have much higher gasoline taxes. And this is the part what I call the truth and honesty in the presentation. Right? So in the truth and honesty part of this, what I want you to think about is, if you're going to add $4 onto the price of gasoline, what are you hoping to do? And the answer is, you're hoping to capture some of that negative externality that comes from driving a car in the form of what's called a user tax, all right, or a user fee. That's what gasoline taxes were basically meant to do. They were meant to give us a way of capturing the congestion that you create on the roadways. So the more you drive your car, the higher gasoline taxes would help to pay for those roadways. They're also meant to capture the additional air pollution that's created by driving your vehicle. And so in a world with high gasoline taxes, the government's able to do what? It's able to take those extra funds and to spread those out in such a way that hopefully you have cars that are more fuel efficient, less toxic for the environment, better roadways, fewer potholes, and all that good stuff. That's based on the idea that a gasoline tax is, in effect, a user charge or a user fee. That breaks down, guys, when you have electric vehicles. Because electric vehicles don't do what? They don't use gasoline. So if you have an electric vehicle and you're driving it around, the good news is you're not adding as many pollutants to the air. The bad news is you're not paying any gasoline tax, which means you're not really paying your fair share of the wear and tear to the roadways that you're on. And you're not actually paying your fair share of the congestion that you create when you get on the roadways as well. So that's a complicated process at work behind figuring out the optimal tax rate. As an economist, all I can tell you is that there are two radically different approaches to how you handle this. One would be a really high tax rate with a high user fee to try to capture most of those negative externalities. And the other one is a somewhat lower tax rate, and you try to get the money through other sources other than just sort of penalizing people for how much they drive. That's one way to think about this. Okay, that's section 2. Here comes the fun part. You've waited for it. All right? We've seen about consumers and producers. We've seen about history. Now I got a whole bunch of predictions, some of which are sure to fail. All right? So don't hold them to me if I come back here in 10 years. Right? But I'm going to do my best to try to give you the lay of the land when it comes to what's happening. Here's the first thing we want to think about. Most of the issues with respect to gasoline and oil production are a function of the fact that there's now fracking, and that in North America we produce about 3 to 4 million barrels of oil a day more than we did 5 years ago. That caught OPEC by surprise. All of a sudden the world's supply of oil was a little bit bigger than it was before. And that meant that there should have been a corresponding adjustment, right, in terms of prices in the marketplace. But OPEC and their 14 members didn't want to cut production. They want what? They want U.S. fracking companies to get cut out of the marketplace instead. So we have a series of decisions being made that I'll simply define as brinkmanship. And the idea is OPEC going to cut its production first? Or if they can keep the price low enough, long enough, will that kill off the U.S. shale industry? That's the game that's being played at a global level. And the good news is, guys, OPEC has already blinked first because oil prices were lower 6 months ago than they are now. They're back up to $45 a barrel, partly because OPEC members were having a tough time making ends meet, trying to maintain their production, which was driving price even lower. And so they said, maybe we'll cut back a little bit. All right? So they've blinked once, but that doesn't mean the battle's over, right? It's a long-term battle. Who's going to blink? Right? And so what we want to think about here is, can OPEC win and cause all of this fledgling production in the United States and Canada to dry up, right? Or is OPEC going to blink because they've got more to lose than these businesses in North America? So here's a little game theory for you, for those of you that love the econ. I love econ. Here it comes. All right? So we've got OPEC, right? OPEC could choose to cut its production, right? Or they can choose to maintain their production targets. Right? In North America, we could have these individual businesses, the individual shale producing businesses, cut their production, or they can maintain their output. Now, there's 4 possibilities up here on this grid. Let's just work our way through them. All right? If OPEC cuts production, right, and North American companies cut production simultaneously, prices would be much higher than they are today, not $45 a barrel. They'd be driven back up again, right? And global revenues would stay high. Do you think private businesses in North America are going to be able to coordinate with OPEC to cut prices, to cut production? No way! It's not going to happen. Couldn't ever happen. All right? So what they're hoping for is one of these outcomes here on this off diagonal. They're hoping the other side has to cave first. And here's the way it works. Right? If I'm a North American company and I'm producing shale, all right, shale oil, right, if I can just maintain my production long enough and it hurts OPEC so bad, right, that politically they have to cave in, right, then what happens here is we can keep our revenues high, our production levels high, and OPEC revenues are going to fall, all right? That's okay for me, all right, if they cut while I maintain, right? OPEC is thinking, no, right? We're going to maintain our production because we want to sell more oil, right? And we're hoping what? We're hoping North American companies go belly up because the price of oil is too low and that we win, all right? But of course, the real truth here is that if both sides are trying to maintain their production, where do we end up? We don't end up there, or there. We end up right here. And that's where we are. Prices have fallen and global revenues have declined. And we're stuck in that position. If I'm a producer, I hate it. If I'm a consumer, right? Man, I love it. This is fantastic, right? Because neither side wants to blink first, right? They don't want to be the one who capitulates. And that's a really interesting thing when you think about the strategy behind this process. So here's the catch. The catch is that oil doesn't cost as much to produce depending upon where you are on this planet. So I want you to look really carefully at this. I'm going to go through it. I'll break it down for you. And this is what OPEC thinks is its advantage in the marketplace. So way over here, you can see onshore Middle East oil. It costs on average $27 a barrel to produce. Now, the blue here is how much it fluctuates. So some of the oil that they can produce in Saudi Arabia, for instance, they can produce for less than $10 a barrel. Some of it costs as much as about $37 or $38. But on average, it's $27. So they've got what? They've got a cost advantage here built in, right? They're the cheapest oil out there, can be found in easily accessible places throughout the Middle East where it doesn't take that much effort to get the oil out of the ground and get to the marketplace. That's what you need to know. Next is offshore shelf oil. So in the continental shelf that would be around various continents, you can get at that oil pretty easily because you just drill down through the water to the continental shelf. And it doesn't take that much extra effort to get down there and find that oil. But obviously, you got a little further to go. It's $41. You've got heavy oil, which is not a very big part of global production because it's really hard to refine the heavy oil. So we don't have to worry too much about that. Then you've got onshore oil from Russia. Cost them about $50 to get. Onshore oil in the rest of the world, ROW, 51. Deep water, really, really deep water oil, where you have to go way, way down to get it, 52. Ultra, ultra deep water, all right? So again, we found ways to get at oil. It's even further down, right? Cost you 56. And then you come to North American shale. So on average, it costs $65 to get a barrel of oil to the marketplace here in North America. So if I'm OPEC and a lot of my companies are in the Middle East and they can produce a barrel of oil for 27, and you see companies in the United States producing oil at 65, or the oil sands in Canada at 70, or Arctic exploration at 75, man, it seems like a pretty easy thing, right? What do? Our production cost is 27. They're thinking like John D. Rockefeller. They're thinking, hey, we got the best possible way of producing cheap oil. Let's drop the price down below what? Below 65. Make all those U.S. and Canadian companies hurt really bad, all right? To the point where they decide to do what? Stop drilling for oil, stop the fracking, everything else, right? You drive all those businesses underground, right? And then once they're gone and you're OPEC, what do you do to the price of oil? You raise the price, of course, right? Because that's the way the game is played. But they misestimated something. Right? What's interesting about this is that this doesn't work. It doesn't work for a couple of reasons I'm going to tell you about. All right? So here are the things that you also want to keep in mind. It turns out that in the Arctic, it has worked. So I'm going to start there. So this is an oil rig platform in the Arctic. And when you're actually in the Arctic and you're trying to get oil out of the ground or out of the water because it's frozen over, what do you have to do? You got to build these enormous rigs. You got to go way down. You have all these challenges with the ice and everything else. And it's really far away from the distribution network. It's just ridiculously hard to get oil out of the Arctic. And Arctic oil production, since oil has fallen, went from like this to like that. I mean, it's just done. Every single major company has given up the rights to leases for oil in the Arctic. They just abandoned their sites. They've done everything else. Why? Because they honestly look at this and they think, hey, right? It costs me $75 just to get that barrel of oil out of the ground. The fixed startup costs are so high, right? If oil's going to be $45, I better cut my losses and get out of here. So that's what they've done. So OPEC was right about Arctic oil exploration, right? There's a lot of oil there. It's just really hard to get. So the price of oil has to be above $100 to kind of make that a good business proposition, and it's not, right? So that's all gone away. And by extension, OPEC thought, well, if the Arctic oil will go away, and that's $75 a pop, then the oil sand oil is going to go away, and the North American shale will go away. That's what they thought. And they almost had it right, but they didn't quite have it right. That's what makes this story fun, all right? So here is a picture of the oil sands in northern Canada. And so, you know, if you just think about the extraction process, you're moving a whole bunch of product because there's a lot of oil in the sands. You got to move it, right, and then extract the oil out of it. Once you've actually built all the roads, right, got all the equipment there, got everything else there, right, and you're actually ready to get the oil out, it turns out that your marginal cost, this would be the main thing if you're one of the students who is here tonight, the marginal cost of extracting that oil, once you've got everything there, turns out to be pretty low. Right? If we had to sort of build all that infrastructure from scratch, it'd be really expensive. So it's not like we're going to open up a new giant pit. But throughout northern Canada, you've got the oil sands already opened up north of Edmonton. And so given you got all the equipment there and everything else you need to get there, it turns out all you have to do is get the product from the oil sands and refine it, and you can get that product to the marketplace, and here's the kicker, at a marginal cost of about $35. So when you factored in all the fixed costs, it was what? 70. But when you just factor in the marginal cost, it's 35. And if oil's 45, you keep the oil sands running. You don't add extra workers, right? Because that would be more fixed costs, extra production, extra drilling in different areas, opening up new stuff. But you know, you got vast tracts of land that are there that are ready to be actually produced. So you keep on producing them at 35. And OPEC had no idea that that was possible. They thought, what? It was 70, not 35. They didn't think at the margin, they just thought in aggregate, and they completely blew that. All right? So yeah, there's some sunk cost there, but the marginal cost is low enough to make it a worldwide venture. And here's the other thing that OPEC didn't think about. They didn't think about their own governments. So what you have right here are all the various OPEC countries which are responsible for about 35 million barrels of oil a day. Now, to the side, you see Saudi Arabia's like this. Saudi Arabia's accounts for what? Accounts for a big share of OPEC, all right? And so their average fiscal break-even point, when you look at their government budget, their fiscal break-even point in Saudi Arabia and throughout OPEC is about $105 a barrel. See, somewhere between the 1970s, when OPEC countries were not very well developed, they didn't have big governments, they didn't have generous benefits that they gave to their citizens, at some point they became bloated, really bloated, right? And they got used to what? They got used to living off of the revenues that came in from oil. And so they built their government budgets based upon expensive oil. So when oil crashes in 2014, then Saudi Arabia goes, well, this is a problem because our budget would balance if the price of oil was $105, right? And now it's 45. We have to do what? We're going to make up the difference. Just like the United States would run a deficit, here's Saudi Arabia running a deficit. And so that's a huge deficit to make up. And it puts a lot of pressure on the Saudi Arabian kingdom, and it puts a lot of pressure on all the various OPEC countries because their government budgets are based upon getting enough revenue in from oil at somewhere near $100 a barrel. So they're not in a really great position to wait either, right? If their governments were used to having expensive oil propping up their budgets and their populations were used to having oil give them things, right, services they might not otherwise have, then for them it's also troubling politically to wait. So OPEC has actually misestimated the true costs of this brinksmanship proposition. They've put themselves in a world of hurt with respect maybe only to Qatar right over here or Kuwait, whose prices are a little bit lower. They've just put themselves in a position where they're going to struggle to maintain politically the dynamic of OPEC being a cartel. And that's why OPEC blinks first in this process and is likely to blink again, right, given that the marginal cost of extracting North American shale or oil sand oil was much, much lower than they actually thought about. In other words, U.S. and Canadian production is not going to suddenly drop to zero. U.S. and Canadian production got to about 10 billion barrels a day, and it's likely to stay near there because those are what? Those are new oil fields, and so you can keep on extracting at a low cost. And so all of a sudden the calculation is completely backwards from what OPEC had hoped. And so they find themselves playing a game where they've completely estimated their opposition. Now, one place where this is especially acute is in Venezuela. So in Venezuela, they have a lot of oil. And for the longest time, they've treated oil as if it was the way in which they could keep their economy going. How many of you know what the price of gasoline was in Venezuela until about 3 years ago? Anybody have an idea how low it was? You could fill up your car with less than 10-cent gasoline. It was 9 cents a gallon in Venezuela. And that's because they had so much oil to export that one of the things they could easily give their citizens was really cheap oil, which made, of course, people very, very happy. And it also allowed them to run a big trade surplus with other countries, which allowed them to fund a lot of other government programs. But the catch for Venezuela is, right, that now that oil is a lot cheaper, their surplus is a lot smaller, and they're now running into massive shortages of basic services throughout their economy. So Venezuela, which is an oil-dependent economy, is perhaps the economy most likely to crack under this current circumstance. And by crack, I mean they're not going to be able to sustain their current political environment in a world where oil suddenly becomes a lot cheaper. So that's the problem for Venezuela. Here's another country that has a big interest in oil. So this would be Russia, and there's Putin. And the Russian economy was already hurting in 2014. And then all of a sudden we had sinking oil prices. So if you're Putin and you have grand designs, right, to be like the most important person on the planet, and all of a sudden your economy is in the tank, right, because oil prices are really low, you've got a big problem. He's got a big political problem. And it's not clear how he solves this problem. Russia by itself can't cut oil production to drive prices up because they need the revenues. So they're kind of stuck with a world of low oil prices. And that drives their military spending. It drives a lot of their other things as well. So if you're Putin, you just don't have an easy escape strategy in this particular case. You just run out of funds very quickly if you're in Russia. So what about the future, guys? Here's the part that I think is the most interesting. There's two ways this might go. And both of them, by the way, leave us with plenty of oil, so we'll never run out of oil. I'll give you the most depressing of the two first, and I'll give you the most optimistic. Here's the most depressing of the two. The first is that we don't get any new technology. That there's American shale, that eventually the Saudis use fracking as well. Everybody uses fracking. But there's only so much oil in the ground. We don't find any extra ways to squeeze that last remaining oil by coming up with some new amazing technology that suddenly gets us more oil. We don't discover any more oil because I don't think there is any more oil to discover, period. And so eventually the supply of oil just doesn't go higher, right? And we keep adding billions of people to the planet. So what do we get? Instead of 7 billion, we get 8, 9, 10, 11 billion people. Even though birth rates are declining, we end up stabilizing at, let's say, 10 to 12 billion people on this planet. But there's not enough oil for 10 to 12 billion people. So now supply and demand are out of balance, right? So there's just way more demand and a lot less supply. And therefore the price of a barrel of oil, $120 a barrel looks small because we get to 150 or 200 or 250, whatever it is, right? Whatever that big number is. So you're thinking to yourself, okay, what does that mean? Well, that means that oil becomes, the price of gasoline becomes something like $10 a gallon. We don't need different technology for oil to reach a point where oil becomes so expensive that we're all going to willingly shift away from oil. We'll all willingly drive electric vehicles at some point. That's one possibility. And at that point where we all willingly shift, we're going to leave some oil in the ground, right? Because something else is cheaper than what? Cheaper than the oil. It's just basic supply and demand. Will still be there. It won't be easy to access, but there'll be known oil reserves that are left untapped under the ground because it's just what? It's just too costly to get at. All right, that's one possible solution. But that's not an exciting solution, right? Because that's just like saying, well, eventually the supply constraint got in the way. All right. The more interesting future is what often happens in markets is that we give individuals an enormous reason to innovate. And so the question is, right, if oil remains high or becomes high again, right, are there going to be enough creative, clever people out there who are looking at alternative energy sources or better ways to design batteries or something else along those lines, right? And somebody discovers a better way of getting something done. So the price of alternative energy is what? It's now cut in half, or it gets cut in 2/3. And so we all wake up one day and we say, wow, well, this is pretty cool, right? The price of a gallon of gasoline is $5, but I can go get this electric vehicle over here and I can run this off of this energy grid for $4, right? And my battery lasts a long time, all right? So maybe that happens too. And if that happens, that's okay as well, because if that happens, right, we're going to leave what? We're going to leave some oil in the ground, all right? So, and that was my major postulate here, that at the end of the day, I wanted to have you think about what? The fact that we're not going to run out of oil. We're actually still going to have oil somewhere, and we'll choose not to tap into it. The same way that we've chosen not to tap into all the coal that is out there, right? There's plenty of coal to be had, right? We didn't run out of coal suddenly, all right? And we're not going to run out of oil suddenly. Instead, what's going to happen is either there's going to be a miraculous technological change and the future is going to be really bright and cool, or there's going to be a somewhat more gloomier, the price of energy gets much more expensive, and either way will be tapped out. So I see Jack over here. He stood up, which means it must be time for some Q&A. Is that correct? All right. On we go then.
So I will bring the microphone around to you. If you hold up your hand, I will kind of keep track of who's next on the list, and we'll start right here.
Hi. So when you were doing that game theory thing, one of the things you said, postulates you said, was that OPEC and the U.S. Oil producers will never cooperate with each other. And to me, that sounds a little bit weird because when we're talking about game theory, the best strategy in game theory is for tick to tack. Mm-hmm. And so and when you're playing that, when both teams are playing that strategy, the best strategy in the game, you do actually get that cooperation. So you do eventually get that quadrant where the prices are higher. And so I'm just curious why that you state that tick for tack is never ever done by both teams.
So in this case, I think you've got two fundamentally different entities. You've got government-run oil production throughout OPEC, where government has a heavy influence on the decision-making process. And you've got independent, for-profit businesses in Canada and the United States. It's very hard for me to imagine that those two diametrically opposed entities could get on exactly the same page and have conversations between BP, right, and Marathon and all these other oil companies and figure out how to work that within the framework of OPEC and a series of government decisions. That's just a really high hurdle. I'm not saying that you're not right, that they might not think about it, but I just think that they're culturally too different to make that happen.
Okay. So you had a graph up there showing the different country prices and taxes on gasoline.
Yes, I did.
And then you mentioned some other states where some people don't pay their fair share because they're driving electric cars and things like that. So you talked about externalities. So how do you figure out an efficient price for an externality when basically you have a monopoly government, whether it's state, local, or federal, setting the prices and saying, here it is? Because you have the different prices with the countries there. Pollution can't be that much different in Italy as it is in whatever country. So how do you get countries to behave themselves and not just set what I call monopoly prices, whether it's building a road, we don't have enough money for roads. Well, how do I know you're spending it efficiently, and what's the fair share?
Well, there's a lot of questions there, but the main thing I guess I would say, as you think about this, is my internal economist is skeptical of a government's ability to have a source of funds and to use those in a judicious way. So it may simply be that, this is just looking at the data, that in Europe it's politically more acceptable to take in a much larger set of funds from gasoline taxes. And our history in the United States is such that because we're more enamored with vehicles and our cities are more spread out and we live in suburbs as opposed to more concentrated areas, that same strategy wouldn't pass the same political test. Now, it passes more of the test here in California because California has higher gasoline taxes than other parts of the country, but it doesn't pass the test in Texas, for instance. So you have a federal gasoline tax and then you have the state levy as well. In Europe, it's just more consolidated, and that's viewed as an acceptable revenue source by individual voters. So you can pass those laws, and even though you're surely right that all those funds are not always spent on mitigating the externalities, they're used for all kinds of different ways. I would still say that it comes back to what will the population accept in that process, which is more of the public choice side of this answer.
Yes, I would like to ask you how much of what is happening right now in the oil markets, how much is due to competition between oil producers, and perhaps how much is due to using oil as a weapon in order to accomplish certain foreign policy goals?
Well, again, that's another good question with a really complicated answer. So. Oil as a weapon is something that has been discussed and has caused wars involving Russia, the United States, Arab countries. I mean, it's just such an important natural resource that certainly that is part of the overall calculus at the geopolitical level. But when it comes to the price of oil and how markets set it, that's simple. That's just supply and demand. And it turns out that each of these big oil companies had a reason why they were interested in fracking and opening up these shale deposits and oil sand deposits. Right? They figured out that there was a price point that would make them money. Right? And so they made a bet on the future that they could make more money. And they understood the underlying economics of it would be that if we actually produce more oil, we're going to increase the supply and the price is likely to go down. I mean, they understood all of that. But there's how the market works to resolve this, which is rationing a scarce resource. And there's the geopolitical nature of, dividing and conquering up certain parts of the world based upon oil supplies. And I think the two just are two separate tracks. And so they kind of do their own thing in different levels.
I just want to comment on the oil price in Europe is much higher, but I think that's a really good strategy because they don't drive as much because all the cities and stuff is like half the size of California. But I guess back in like 2008, during like the when the gases were like $5 per gallon, which I was still alive back then. I'm really young, but I wasn't like not born yet in 2008. So I remember like. It was like hell on earth when it was that price, but $5 is still relatively cheap compared to Europe. So I think we kind of rely so much on cars and stuff. So yeah, and we still got by. Like nobody was like dying. So
yeah, so that's just a comment, and I guess I would add to that comment that at a higher price point, you can obviously people respond to incentives. So at a price of $6 or $7, or in Europe, at those times it was actually close to 10 in Europe at that point. People were very cognizant of how far they would drive, and they were much more likely to take public transportation, take trains, take other ways of getting around. So I mean, if that's something that you want to promote, and you're interested in sort of promoting that type of way of living, then obviously manipulating the gas tax could be one way to alter the way people would choose to use transportation.
Hi, I was wondering if you see like a third scenario where there's instead of innovation with the alternatives, there's innovation within the oil industry, whereby lowering marginal costs and an increase in supply on that side?
No, that's a really great question. You know, I guess if you had asked me that question 10 years ago, before we got to the North American shale boom, I would have been skeptical that we could have like gotten more oil out of the ground, and all of a sudden now we're getting a whole lot more oil out of the ground. The harder part is that the first time you go in and get the oil out, you get a certain percentage of the oil out, right? It's readily accessible. You tap into it. That's what we did with, still doing in the Middle East. That's what we did in this country in the early days of the 19th century. We just, hey, there's here, it's oil, it's easy, let's go get it, right? Then you work harder, right, to get the oil out, right? So now we got to go through fracking to get the oil out, right? And then we've also designed ways to like dig dig horizontally to get at oil that previously we weren't able to get to. So we've come up with a lot of clever strategies. Is there another clever strategy out there? Maybe, probably. I think you're right. But I think we've already gotten a lot of the oil out of those known reserves. So if there is some other clever strategy, you know, if we've already gotten most of it, maybe we can get a little bit more. But I don't think we can get the same kind of really big boom for our extra dollars.
If oil prices remain low, do you think that oil exporting countries such as Venezuela and Saudi Arabia will be able to adapt to this? And if they do, how will their economies appear?
So in the case of Venezuela, they already are in the process of having to adapt to this because they're making those choices. And they're really hard, right? Because they've been granted so much cool stuff and free food and other things otherwise that the oil money had brought in, that people are finding out that they don't have an adequate market system to actually help their economy function. So I'd say Venezuela is going through it. And what you just hope if you're a Venezuelan, right, is that you're able to somehow make this transition to a more market-oriented price point in your economy without having disruption and revolution. You hope that would happen. In Saudi Arabia, it's much harder to say. Here's why. The Saudis have been very successful with oil for a very long time. And they've actually built up a surplus of funds, which is going to help to sustain them through this period for a while. The longer term question with the Saudis is really they don't want to be oil dependent economy. They actually want to diversify their economy. And that means what? That means investing a lot in infrastructure, education, and sort of preparing their citizens to be individuals who can compete in the 21st century economy, which is largely a service sector economy, not so much driven by manufacturing. If they get to that point, by the time the oil runs out, they'll make the transition. If they don't, they're in for a really hard time.
Hi, I was just a little bit curious. Most of your presentation is focused on oil that comes from the earth. And I know there's recent innovations that have been using bacteria to produce oil. And I'm wondering if you know how much it costs per barrel and if they're going to be competitive anytime soon.
Well, they're not competitive yet, but this would be along the lines of what I was talking about with innovation, right? Because if we can create oil from bacteria that's at a good price point and produce it at a lower point, and some of the studies suggest that price point for the bacteria might be in the neighborhood of $50 to $60 a barrel, that could radically change how we produce oil. And that would be a good thing, right? Because that's yet another way in which we get innovation producing more of something that we need until we get a better way of providing energy. But I didn't talk about it because it's not quite yet here. It would be awesome if it was here, but it's not here yet.
How far into the future is it possible to hedge the price of oil with futures contracts and options, and have the oil producers had been hedging, or had they hedged previously? And do you know what the futures markets are telling us about the expectations of the price of oil?
Yeah, so the future markets are very much locked in at the moment on lower priced oil into the foreseeable future. And that's partly driven by the fact that it doesn't appear that OPEC has the cohesiveness to be able to cut production. And if they don't, then you're left in a world where oil is going to be relatively plentiful from a variety of sources, some of which are not even tapped. So that's what caused a lot of the Arctic companies to actually just say, the handwriting is on the wall. All of these futures point to lower prices. So we're going to bail out now, even though we've invested billions of dollars, because we just don't see the return in the next, to answer your question, we don't see the return in the next 10 years. So that's how far out these markets comfortably go. So the markets, of course, could be totally wrong because they could misestimate the geopolitical nature of this. But everything suggests that if you wanted to plan for somewhat cheaper oil, that's probably what you should be doing.
All right, so I have a public policy related question. Currently, we have a lot of subsidies or public policies that really support and bolster the oil and natural gas economy. You mentioned two possibilities where one, the price of oil just becomes exorbitantly high, or we find new innovations in alternative methods of energy. Do you see, with the way lobbying exists currently in the US, do you foresee increased lobbying for the oil and natural gas companies to the point where we end up over supporting them, we don't get enough innovation, and we end up in the more unpleasant future where we rely too heavily on gas and we run out, it just gets too high? Or do you see government changing in its policies, subsidizing and supporting innovations, and then we get the innovation ending?
That's an easy one for me. We're going to see both. The oil industry is a very mature industry. They have an extensive lobbying in not only D.C., but in any oil-producing state. That they have huge lobbying, lots of money to spend. So that's not going away. And by that I mean energy transition from within, is just very difficult. And so it's not easy to take an oil company and suddenly make them a solar company. You can have a spin-off, right? A separate division, and that might work as a method to sort of slowly transition yourself, but they will fight to protect the way in which oil has been developed and regulated in this country as a way of maintaining the existing set of companies that are there. At the same time, one of the things that the U.S. government has done and a lot of state governments have done is they provided seed money to various startups, and those startups, more often than not, they miss, but every once in a while they hit big, and so the question is, will something hit big, which would allow us to sort of make a separate track where the oil companies stay big and stay important until whatever this other new innovation looks like has a chance to get going in a parallel track. And at that point, my inner economist tells me that those oil companies will see the handwriting on the wall and they will try to transition there as fast as they can as energy companies to also get in onto the new track as well. So, but that's likely to be dual tracks.
So specifically, like with regard to the U.S. government, when it comes, when this standoff between OPEC and U.S. oil fracking comes into play, if OPEC actually looks to be able to outlast the U.S. fracking, do you imagine the government actually coming into play in terms of trade barriers and things like that to actually give fracking a better chance of winning the standoff?
I personally don't. The general movement in this country is not on the side of oil industries and coal and things like that. And if the political landscape continues to shift in the direction that it has been shifting, I think it would be difficult for governments to somehow protect a relatively mature industry that's energy related that has some serious environmental concerns. And I just don't think it meets the test for protecting them. And so we would allow what? We would allow most North American shale companies to go into hibernation at that particular point. And they could be brought online in the future, but the same thing would happening with oil right now is coal companies in West Virginia and in Kentucky. Those coal deposits are there, but they're all shuttering their doors. And the idea is, we could go back and tap into it if we wanted to. I just don't see us protecting that particular energy source.
So it looks like we have reached the end of our time here. I'm sure there's still some questions percolating around in your mind, and you're more than welcome to join us over at Flames. But I'd like to give Dirk a big hand. Thank you so much.